I've been using a GTX 1070 for years, and honestly, I never felt a huge urgency to replace it. But after upgrading to an RTX 5070 Ti, I started noticing things I wasn't expecting. Not just higher FPS, but a completely different experience. So I decided to put both cards to the test. Benchmarks, real gameplay, power consumption, and most importantly, whether I'd been missing out all these years. And honestly, the answer surprised me. I think what makes this upgrade interesting is that the GTX 1070 isn't actually a bad GPU. Even in 2026, it can still run a surprising number of games. Fortnite? No problem. Red Dead Redemption 2 still looks fantastic. And that's exactly why I held onto it for so long. The 1070 was still doing its job. I wasn't replacing broken hardware. I wasn't replacing unusable hardware. I was replacing hardware that was still surprisingly capable. And that's why I kept asking myself, what am I actually gaining here? Because on paper, the GTX 1070 was still doing everything I needed it to do. But PC gaming has changed a lot over the last decade. And I wanted to find out whether those changes actually mattered in the real world. The first thing I noticed was that modern GPUs just feel different. Not necessarily because they're dramatically bigger, especially compared to my GTX 1070 Gaming X, because that was already a pretty substantial card. But looking at them side by side, you can definitely see things have changed over the years. The 1070 feels like a really well-built graphics card. The 5070 Ti feels like a graphics card that's been designed around an entirely different set of expectations. Cooling is clearly a much bigger priority now. The heatsink is larger, the cooler is thicker, and everything about the design suggests it's expected to handle a lot more power than GPUs from a decade ago. One thing that surprised me was how well the GTX 1070 has aged physically. Looking at it today, it still feels like a premium graphics card. It doesn't look outdated, it doesn't feel cheaply built. And sitting next to the 5070 Ti, it actually holds up remarkably well. The differences are there, but they're more subtle than I expected. Even the ports tell part of the story. But when the GTX 1070 launched, having a DVI connector was completely normal. Now it's gone entirely. Everything revolves around DisplayPort and HDMI. And of course, there are all the technologies that have become part of modern PC gaming. Ray tracing, DLSS, frame generation. None of those were really part of the conversation when the GTX 1070 launched. So even before looking at performance, it was obvious these cards came from very different eras of PC gaming. But specs and features only tell you so much. What really matters is what happens when you actually start using them. Swapping the cards was probably the easiest part of the whole process, but it was also one of those moments where the scale of the upgrade became very real, and the GTX 1070 had been sitting in this system for years. So removing it felt a little bit like retiring an old teammate. Before jumping into the games, I wanted to see what the benchmarks had to say. Starting with TimeSpy, the GTX 1070 scored 5928. Then, Steel Nomad came back with a score of 1257. And surprisingly, it even managed to complete Port Royal, scoring 1328. Honestly, for a card that launched back in 2016, that's pretty impressive. What surprised me the most wasn't TimeSpy, it was Port Royal, because despite not having dedicated ray tracing hardware, the GTX 1070 still managed to complete the benchmark. Obviously the score isn't remotely close to the 5070 Ti, but the fact that it ran at all is pretty impressive for a card approaching its 10th birthday. Then I swapped in the 5070 Ti and ran the same tests again, and this is where things started getting a bit silly. TimeSpy jumped all the way to 22,106. Steel Nomad went from 1257 to 6638. And Port Royal absolutely exploded, climbing from 1328 to 19,067. At that point, it was pretty clear these two cards weren't even aimed at the same type of gaming experience anymore. But benchmarks are only part of the story. The real question is, how much of that difference do you actually feel once you're in a game? So let's find out. Starting with Fortnite, and honestly this is one of the games that reminded me why I kept my GTX 1070 for so long. At 1080p, it's still a very capable card. Moving up to 1440p, the experience remains surprisingly good. If all you play is competitive games, you could easily argue that the GTX 1070 still has life left in it. But after spending time with the 5070 Ti, I started noticing something that wasn't immediately obvious from the FPS numbers alone. The average frame rate was higher, of course, but what stood out was how consistent everything felt. The lows were better, the frame times were cleaner, and the card always seemed to have performance in reserve. Even during busy moments, it never felt like it was working particularly hard. One thing that stood out was how differently these cards handled higher resolutions. The GTX 1070 could still keep up, but the further I pushed things, the more comfortable the 5070 Ti became. And that ended up becoming a recurring theme throughout this entire upgrade. The biggest difference wasn't always the headline FPS number, it was how effortless the experience felt. Red Dead Redemption 2 is where things started to get really interesting. Because before doing this testing, I already knew the GTX 1070 could run the game. What I didn't know was how much of a difference the extra GPU power would actually make. And honestly, the 1070 still holds up surprisingly well. With a few sensible tweaks and FSR enabled, it's still a very playable experience. But as soon as I started increasing the resolution, the cracks began to show. At 1080p, things are generally fine. At 1440p, you're starting to make more compromises. And by the time you get to 4K, you are constantly making trade-offs between image quality and performance. Red Dead Redemption 2 is also one of those games where image quality really starts to matter. The jump from 1080p to 1440p is noticeable. But 4K is where the world really starts to come alive. Especially when you're looking across long distances or riding through dense environments. On the GTX 1070, the game is still playable, but it never really feels comfortable. The RTX 5070 changes that completely. Instead of trying to make 4K work, it just works. And that was probably one of the biggest surprises of this upgrade. The 5070 Ti finally made 4K feel like something I'd choose, not just something I'd test. Cyberpunk was the game I was most curious about going into this upgrade. Because this feels like the kind of game that simply didn't exist when the GTX 1070 launched. Cyberpunk is one of the best examples of how much PC gaming has changed over the last decade. The GTX 1070 can still run the game, but you're constantly thinking about what settings you need to turn down and what compromises you're willing to make. The 5070 Ti felt completely different. For the first time, I stopped thinking about the settings menu and just played the game. Cyberpunk was also the first game where I found myself using technologies that simply weren't available to me on the GTX 1070. DLSS, frame generation, ray tracing. Whether you love these technologies or hate them, there's no denying how much they've changed modern PC gaming. And that might sound like a small thing, but after years of tweaking settings to squeeze every bit of performance out of older hardware, it was actually one of the biggest differences I noticed. Of course, all that extra performance comes at a cost. The 5070 Ti definitely pulls more power than the GTX 1070. The numbers you're seeing include both the PC and the monitor, but honestly, this was one of the areas I expected to bother me more than it actually did. Once I started seeing what the card was capable of, especially at 1440p and 4K, the extra power draw felt a lot easier to justify. That's not to say it doesn't matter, it absolutely does. But the jump in performance is so large that I rarely found myself worrying about it while actually using the card. One thing became very clear during all this testing. The 5070 Ti feels like a completely different card depending on the resolution you're playing at. At 1080p, It's incredibly fast, maybe even more GPU than a lot of people actually need. At 1440p, things start making a lot more sense. The card stretches its legs a little, and the balance between image quality and performance feels excellent. But at 4K, everything finally clicked for me. This is where I stopped looking at benchmarks and started thinking about how the games actually felt to play. The GTX 1070 can get there, but the 5070 Ti feels comfortable there, and that's a big difference. When I bought my QD OLED monitor, I always knew it was capable of showing more than what my GTX 1070 could comfortably deliver. The monitor wasn't the limitation anymore, the GPU was, and I think that's why this upgrade felt so different. For the first time, the display and the graphics card finally felt matched. For years, 4K gaming felt like something I could test, something I could experiment with, but not something I genuinely wanted to use every day. This was the first upgrade that changed that. So was this upgrade worth it? For me? Absolutely. But probably not for the reason most people would expect. And the funny thing is, the FPS wasn't actually what impressed me the most. It was the reduction in compromise. Less tweaking, less worrying, less fighting against hardware limitations. Looking back, I probably hold on to my GTX 1070 longer than most people would have. And honestly, I don't regret it. It gave me nearly a decade of great gaming experiences. But after spending time with the 5070 Ti, I finally understand what I've been missing. Not because the GTX 1070 suddenly became a bad GPU. It didn't. The GTX 1070 wasn't replaced because it became useless. It was replaced because technology moved on. Next, I'm putting DLSS and frame generation to the test to find out if they're actually worth it.